Thank you for joining us for Reed Smith's update on the California Office of Tax Appeals. I'm Shail Shah. I'm a partner in the state tax practice in the Los Angeles office.
And I'm Mike Shake. I'm counsel in the Los Angeles office, also in the state tax group. And today we'll be talking about the Office of Tax Appeals.
So the Office of Tax Appeals was established by the Taxpayer Transparency Fairness Act in July 2017. And to kind of lay the landscape prior to the establishment of the OTA, California had three taxing agencies. They had the Franchise Tax Board, which administers the income franchise taxes for the state of California, the Board of Equalization, which administers the sales and use taxes and other business taxes, and also heard appeals from the Franchise Tax Board and the Board of Equalization, and then the Employment Development Department, the EDD, which administers the payroll taxes. So with the Taxpayer Transparency Fairness Act in 2018, what that did was it stripped the powers away from the Board of Equalization to just as California constitutional powers. So now you have the OTA, the Office of Tax Appeals, which hears appeals from the newly established California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, which now handles all the sales and use taxes and other business taxes, and also hears appeals from the Franchise Tax Board. In order to effectuate the statute, the OTA established emergency regulations back in July of last year, and the emergency regulations were set to expire in December of 2018. The OTA has gone through several drafts of proposed regulations, and they're actually on the third draft now, which was issued back in May. And it looks like from all signs that the last draft issued back in May will probably be the final draft.
So going back to the change, Shail, what prompted all of this? Because from my perspective, it felt like a huge change about the whole process in California that happened in a very short period of time.
Yeah, so it became apparent to the public a couple of years ago that the Board of Equalization, which again, it was a 5-member elected board that heard these tax cases, were using the Board of Equalization staff, which were generally, the staff members were supposed to be used just for tax matters. They were using these staff members for their own political gain, so helping them out on campaigns and other kind of political activities. And when this became apparent, Governor Jerry Brown actually asked the state legislature to strip the power away from the Board of Equalization and to establish these two different agencies now. Okay.
So that left us, as Shail mentioned, we ended up with emergency regulations that were promulgated last year. And what that did was it gave us some temporary rules that, with an extension, are going to last through 2018. Those emergency regulations, though, they were put together pretty quickly, and that was because the law passed in June, and so the OTA basically had about 6 months to hire all of its employees and create all of the rules on which we're going to hear tax appeals, and that's just a very short amount of time to do all of that. And so they ended up promulgating emergency regulations that took effect January 1st of this year and will become ineffective at the end of the year. Because of the shortened timeline, though, there were a lot of issues with the emergency regulations, the biggest of which were there were some inconsistencies. There was inconsistencies on briefing periods. So, for example, if you file a brief or an appeal for an income tax matter, you had a certain amount of time to file your brief and then to file your reply brief later. But for sales tax matters, you actually had less time. So there was this element of potential surprise that might come about. There were also other issues around requests for hearings and a lot of different things that would just put practitioners in potential pitfalls. And so that was one of the things that the OTA wanted to clear up and create a lot of consistency. And so they've been, since the beginning of the year, they've been in this process of creating final regulations that will take us through, into the future for the Office of Tax Appeals. Those final regulations, they clear up just about all of those inconsistencies. And now, if you're a practitioner in this area, you will probably know, or you should know, exactly what the rules are and what you can and can't do, how long you have to do things, how to request, hearings and other things. So there is a lot of consistency in these new proposed final regulations. The status of that is, as Shail mentioned, the last draft we saw was in May. We're expecting that to be finalized in its current form or something very close to it so that it can take effect next year.
So Mike, if I have a matter either at the Franchise Tax Board or the CDTFA, how do I get that appeal to the OTA?
Yeah, so a lot of people think this might change, or you might think this might change the appeal process, but really it doesn't change the appeal process for the vast majority of cases. For the vast majority, let's say you have an income tax appeal, you're still going to stay within the Franchise Tax Board's specific appeal process. And that's filing a protest and going through that process. And it's only when it comes out of that Franchise Tax Board or CDTFA process that you get to the Office of Tax Appeals. So when a protest or an appeal at the FTB or CDTFA becomes final, then you would appeal that final decision on the protest or appeal up to the Office of Tax Appeals. It's a little different for refunds because you can deem a refund denied and go up to the Office of Tax Appeals pretty quickly. So if you want to fast track things, you can use the Office of Tax Appeals to do that. And frankly, if Office of Tax Appeals, for one reason or another, is not your thing, you can even still deem a refund denied and go straight to court. So that option is still available.
So one of the biggest changes with the Office of Tax Appeals, and especially with the new proposed regulations, is that it creates two tracks to appeal a matter. You have an informal track and a formal track. And so the informal track is the default track if you don't request an oral hearing with the OTA. So generally these are matters that are where the taxpayer is pro se, so not represented by a representative. Generally simple issues, penalty, late filing penalty abatements or statute of limitation issues. So generally not, probably a lot of you out there is probably not the type of track that you would be on. For most of you, you'd probably be on the formal track. You would ask for an oral hearing, which would, by default would put you on the formal track. And then a lot of the kind of the formal rules, such as subpoena rules and discovery, come into play within the formal track. And again, generally those taxpayers are represented by a taxpayer representative.
So, Shale, we're bringing in these APA rules. Are these new to the tax world? Is that something that we're going to have to navigate that's brand new, or is that something that's been around?
Yeah, it's a good question. They are and they're not. They're not in the sense that the informal rules with the APA are actually very similar to the appeal rules over at the old Board of Equalization. What is new is the formal rules. You didn't have the kind of the subpoena rules and the evidentiary rules that you have now with the formal track. So that's really the big change between the two.
Okay. And so speaking of, there's under the formal rules, there's a lot of guidance there that really wasn't there in the old system. And some people might ask, what's the benefit of formal rules? Isn't an informal process better? And frankly, the benefit of the formal rules is it creates a lot more certainty in the system. And it also allows you to use the OTA to your best advantage as the arbiter of various things. So for example, the formal rules have specific discovery processes in place. And under that formal discovery process, you can use that ALJ as the arbiter to determine whether or not certain information should be passed back and forth. A lot of people might think that, okay, this is a tax case, really isn't discovery all about getting taxpayer information to the taxing agency. And that is a part of it, but there is also a lot of information that you can glean from discovery that you get from the taxing agency about your case or about similar matters that could be very beneficial. And it's a lot better to have a third-party Office of Tax Appeals deciding whether or not you're entitled to that information than having that actual agency be the arbiter there. There's also evidentiary rules that come in with the more formal process, so you can you have a better understanding of what you can and cannot bring in to prove up your case. There's rules on preventing that surprise on the day of the hearing. And so there's rules preventing you from doing certain things too late in the game and not allowing the other side to really have an opportunity to review information that would be beneficial at a hearing. By far the most important thing, I think, about this whole process is the written opinions, though. Not every written opinion is going to be precedential, but every case will have a written opinion. So we will have an understanding going forward as these cases kind of keep piling up of what the ALJs think of certain matters and how they decide and what their thinking is, just the same that we do for court cases. And that's just an amazingly great part of the process. Whereas in the old BOE system, you didn't really have too much of that. You had some written information. Very few cases actually ended up with a fully written opinion. So that's really one of the benefits from it all.
So speaking of the ALJs, like you, I live in Los Angeles. So if I have a matter at the FTB or CDTFA and I appeal it to the OTA, do I actually have to go to Sacramento to hear my case?
No, you don't. So they're going to have hearing offices in Los Angeles, Sacramento, and also Fresno. So the Central Valley will also be able to, relatively quickly get to a hearing. They'll have ALJs based in Sacramento and LA, but that doesn't mean that, for example, an LA hearing will have just LA ALJs. They'll mix it up so that it's not kind of the same faces every time. So it'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, I agree.
So what's next?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. The OTA started hearing cases, so they took over old cases from the BOE and started hearing new cases starting January 1st of this year. And most of the cases so far have been fairly simple cases. I think for the most part they've been pro se cases. There's only been one precedential opinion. It was on a procedural matter. So we haven't actually seen the more complex issues make their way up through the chain through the CDTFA and FTB. I think once we get to that level where we see some of the more complex cases, you see taxpayer representatives actually representing the taxpayers, we're going to start seeing a lot of these proposed regulations put in practice. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and what kind of comes up through the chain over the next 12 months.
Great. So that's our presentation. Thank you for joining us. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email Shale or myself or give either one of us a call. There will be plenty more information to come as we figure out how the OTA kind of pans out. Thank you.